Hello and welcome to Dear Pandemic. I'm Malia Jones and I'm here today with an interview with Amani Martorella. Amani earned a Master's of Science in Social Work at UW-Madison in 2005 and is now a licensed clinical social worker in the state of Maryland. She's the Senior Clinical Social Worker at the Johns Hopkins University's Student Counseling Center, and she advises an undergraduate peer counseling group called A Place to Talk. And she joins us today to talk about people who are in their young adulthood and returning to college, and how we can support them in doing that. And in addition to her roles at the Johns Hopkins Counseling Center, Amani was my college roommate and has been for the last 20 years, one of my very dearest friends in the whole world. And I brought a very special picture of the two of us in our 20s, I think at UW-Madison, wearing our Elvis Rocks t-shirts, which we got in Graceland.
Of course. I wasn't sure what picture you were getting out there just for a second.
Yeah, I chose carefully.
Yeah.
So Amani, thanks for joining us. I'm really excited to hear your thoughts on students. So in your view, how did the pandemic affect college students last spring as things started to unfold?
So needless to say, this pandemic is sucking for everyone in lots of different ways. I think the experience for young people in college is unique. So obviously in some ways they are less affected because they may have less reasons to be concerned about the virus, but in terms of their level of disruption to their lives has been huge. Certainly with both my clients that I work with as well as the students I work with in APTT, the student group that you mentioned, having especially students at maybe elite universities like Hopkins that do a lot of planning and a lot of this is how the next 3 weeks are going to go, this is how the semester's going to go, this is how the year's going to go, and I have this internship and I have this lined up for this lab. The very, very abrupt disruption of that. And by the way, we need to send you all home and we don't know when you're coming back, was incredibly difficult. A lot of the students that I work with in the student group were seniors who were very much looking forward to the traditions that we do with our student group at the end of the year, looking forward to their graduations, their last pizza run, the last hangout on this quad, or
all those
late night walks, and all the things that they were expecting to do, looking forward to doing. Of course, graduation as well, which for many of them who work so very hard, as many college students do, to get to this place where they can kind of feel that they've reached this goal, and then to have that rite of passage severely impacted, so that it is now looking at a screen. So the students that I work with were really, really sad. Lots of grieving, and we talked about that a lot, about that it is entirely, and then feeling guilty because they were grieving something that they felt they shouldn't need to grieve, because there were people that were sick and people losing jobs, and in the scheme of things, it shouldn't be a big deal to not miss out on this or that, but trying to validate the fact that it doesn't mean it doesn't hurt and doesn't suck to miss out on the things that they were really looking forward to doing.
Yeah, and it's not super helpful to get into like the Despair Olympics like that either.
Absolutely.
So what were some of your challenges trying to support students through all of that?
So for our counseling center, I would say that one of the significant challenges, which were not at all unique to Hopkins, most of our students aren't from Maryland, right? So the way that our licensing works, I'm a clinical social worker, but many of the folks in our counseling center are psychologists. Our licenses are state bound. So when students are asked to disperse back to their homes on a dime, all around the country and all around the world, we are no longer able to provide treatment. So many states, although it was absolutely on a state-by-state basis, many states provided some level of interim reciprocity on an emergency basis because of the pandemic. So, Illinois would give 60 days, Florida would give 90 days, Wisconsin, and I'm making those numbers up, but in terms of, we had to research what the different policies across state lines were going to be for each student, for each state. but they were temporary, and some of them required some jumping through hoops and some didn't. But it meant that it created an enormous amount of confusion because there was no orchestrated, coordinated federal response around mental health. And it meant that students that were at high risk or high need, we had a lot of challenges being able to provide continuous support for them in the way that we would want. Obviously, the other piece that is, now doesn't seem like a big deal anymore, but our counseling center didn't do any kind of teletherapy at all. And so we went from doing zero teletherapy to 100% teletherapy in the matter of about 3 weeks, which required, obviously the software upgrades and making sure everybody had the right kind of Wi-Fi at home and all that, as well as the training, because the actual clinical work of doing teletherapy is a little bit different. There's things to consider that you don't have to consider when you're doing in-person treatment. So I would say certainly the abrupt nature of everybody departing, and the licensure stuff at this point is going to continue to be a challenge because most of those kind of emergency interim reciprocity arrangements have expired. And so there's not really a great solution from our perspective on kind of how to do that, except for individual clinicians pursuing additional licensures in other states.
You would actually have to go get licensed in every state where you have a client you're providing therapy with.
Could, that would be one option. Some states, for instance, we have a lot of students from California. California only allows you to become licensed if you go in person to take their ethics exam or licensing exam. So some states but have different barriers for becoming licensed. Some states it's a question of, filling out some forms and sending in some money. But that is something we're looking into. Some of our psychologists and social workers already are licensed in multiple states. But what Hopkins did, and I know many of other universities did, is immediately contract with a nationwide teletherapy service that does have licensing across all state lines.
Oh, I see.
But that creates other challenges because we don't have clear communication with that agency. And they are a warehousing agency in terms of creating connections with those students with independent clinicians, but it's not at all actually connected to the university. So those are challenges.
So it sounds like you mostly lost contact with at least some of the students that you were supporting in a clinical sense, but you were still in contact with the peer counseling group members.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I would say that in terms of our clients, we are seeing a fraction of the clients that we saw before. So graduate students who tend to remain in Baltimore, where Hopkins is, obviously we were able to continue providing service to them. But many, if not most, of our undergraduates left. And so, it was a fraction. The peer counseling group that I work with, A Place to Talk, I've had a lot of contact with them, and they're and again, they're really struggling. So that those that weren't seniors, for many students, going home is not necessarily great. For a lot of students, coming to college was the respite from various traumas or challenging things that were going on at home, and coming to college was a way of kind of freeing themselves of that, and not to mention taking on a level of independence and autonomy, of course. So the abrupt return to home is not a happy thing for a lot of students. Some students, like I said, might have family things going on that are very stressful, or have responsibilities with elder members of the family or younger members of the family, or various other challenges that make being home very, very stressful. Mm-hmm. So again, with it being that abrupt, and then at this point being indefinite of how long for many students, how long they may remain home versus coming back to campus, many of them feel very, very isolated and discouraged. And again, those aren't unique experiences in folks of that age, but they're experiencing it in a different way than those of us that are older might be experiencing it.
Yeah.
Certainly college is a time for self-exploration and making connections and figuring out who we are as adults and kind of paving that path of kind of what kind of people we're going to be. And for somebody who if that process for them was, going away to college, having that abruptly taken away, and reorienting them back to home interrupts that process and makes it very jarring, and again, very very challenging for them to feel
Super
connected or feel
disruptive.
rooted and supported.
Yeah, and I think that point that the indefinite nature of it is really, that's a huge challenge for everyone. Just the ongoing uncertainty. Uncertainty is the benchmark of 2020.
Absolutely. And again, this isn't unique to Hopkins at all, but as a university that attracts high achieving students, these are students who, often starting in middle school, were planning out their futures semester by semester. I'm going to take this math so I can take this physics, so I can get this SAT score, so that I can be eligible for this scholarship, so I can go to this college and major in this and take and they get this internship. And so they have these very rigid and very narrow trajectories of what their future is supposed to look like. So to not only have that disrupted, but disrupted in a way where it's not like, it's okay, it's just in one semester, and then we'll all be able to go back to this in the spring or in the fall, is, for some students, again, because they're young, they haven't, for some of them, this is the first time they've had a major disruption in their life like this. Certainly for many of us it is, that it's hard to, they don't know how to cope with that, that level of uncertainty, because for many of them, they've kind of been scripting out their career path for a long time.
Right, right. So looking ahead, here at UW-Madison in Wisconsin, which is also your alma mater, we're anticipating the arrival of many thousands of undergrads and grad students for a start of in-person instruction at the end of this month. Many universities around the nation are bringing students back for in-person instruction to some extent or another. And, here we have a pretty robust plan for how to do that in a way that is safe and managed, at least from the perspective of academic life. But we've seen locally that young people are very capable of spreading COVID-19 in social settings. We saw that happening here in Madison over the summer. And so I'm wondering about your thoughts on what's the role of universities in making those social interactions happen safely?
It's a really important question. And I think as I'm watching and participating in the process of the plans for how students are coming back, and Hopkins is releasing that information, and not as if it's been kept on the shelf all this time. People are madly trying to put this together.
Yeah, everyone.
All with everyone is all with the very best of intentions. I think the trick is that there already feels to be a lot of, this is what you can't do, this is what you're limited in doing. The students are being invited to come back, and we are doing a phased reopening. I think the challenge is going to be, and I think where universities across the board I think what would be very helpful is making sure that students understand what they can be doing, not just what they can't be. When they hear the message of come on back, we're going to try to create as much of a collegiate experience for you as possible. If you're 19 or 20, you're immediately thinking about which friends you're going to see, which student groups you're going to re-engage with. Am I going to get to play basketball? Am I going to get to do rock climbing? Am I going to get to hang out with my anime buddies?
Yeah,
The dance group and the a cappella group, like all the stuff, right? Because that's what college is about for so many students. And so right now it feels like, and again, I don't think this is unique to Hopkins at all. It's a lot of, here's what you can't do. Here are the limits. Here's what's not allowed. And I do wonder what that means in terms of like what's going to happen when students come back, because they're going to be looking for ways to connect, and they're going to be looking for ways to do stuff. They've been cooped up in their parents' basement or their parents' house for 6 months. They want to go do stuff. And I don't blame them. That's part of the deal of being a young adult. So what are the spaces, what are the ways that they can do things that minimizes risk and minimizes exposure? Are there ways that the universities can literally create physical spaces outside that student groups can reserve the same way they might reserve a gymnasium or a dance studio, that are outside, that are limited to 10 or limited to 15, whatever the magic number is, that has parameters and has guidelines on how that space is used. But are there places that the university can not just put barriers and roadblocks up where they are absolutely should be there, but also create opportunities?
Right.
And I think the other piece of that is communicating the message of, we get it, this is really hard. We want to help you figure out how to do some stuff. Because in the absence of that engagement, I think college students are going to find ways to do stuff, and they may not necessarily make the best choices around that. Mm-hmm. So I do think there's a lot about getting the buy-in of young adults around how to socialize and hang out as safely as possible.
Yeah. It sounds like some paneling is necessary in terms of, like, you can't just say what not to do. You have to say, like, here's the direction for what you can do.
Absolutely. Because I think the one thing that college students, young adults tend to not like is other grown-ups telling them what they can and can't, or what they can't do, right? And if there's a lot of the, finger wagging kind of tone to anything that's going on, college students tend to be maybe more apt to go, those grown-ups don't know what they're talking about. It doesn't affect me, or I'm not going to do anything too serious. But we also know that young adults tend to take more risks and are more comfortable with risk taking, because that's part of the deal of becoming a young adult, is you kind of test those boundaries and limits for yourself to kind of see kind of where those are for yourself, because they've been implemented and artificially placed for you as you grow up, and then you get to college and you get to test what those boundaries are for yourself. And unfortunately, right now is not a great time for young people to be doing that, because the implications of that are really big. So I'm concerned or wondering if one of the things that could happen is if young people are feeling as though older people / grown-ups who don't really understand are going to be making a whole bunch of rules that don't feel applicable, and then they're going to go do the thing they want to do anyway.
Yeah.
Instead of engaging with them in a more collaborative fashion, where those of us that are older say, we get it, this sucks. Let's talk about what we can do and make the most of what we can do and minimize the risk as much as possible. But let's all agree that having a giant party of 100 people is a really bad idea right now. Can we all agree on that? So what can you do when you're in a group of 10 outside? Like what are the ways we can do that, and how can the university help make that happen? Right? Not just
like part of this is those of us who are in the leadership roles of creating some of these boundaries need to understand, like, what's developmentally appropriate for this age group. We've talked about that on a few other occasions, that it may not be developmentally appropriate to expect 20-year-olds to behave in ways that are completely altruistic.
It's not really part of what 20-year-olds are known for. And that's okay. It doesn't mean they're bad people. But if we're being really honest, and we think back to what we were doing when we were 20.
Oh, yeah. 20.
If we're being really honest,
yeah.
Altruism and selflessness are not usually the character traits we think of in our own selves, right? And it's very hard to expect that out of 20-year-olds now. And it's not 20-year-olds in a vacuum, it's 20-year-olds who have been cooped up for the last 6 months like the rest of us have been, right? Yeah. So in some ways, they are antsier and more restless than your regular 20-year-old in a parallel universe, right? They are, and feeling more isolated and more disconnected, and they are yearning for that. I know so many of the young people that I work with, and somewhat through clients, but definitely through the student group I work with, they're really struggling. They're really struggling. They miss being with their friends, and either they're home, and so they're feeling isolated because they're at home instead of with their peer group, which is where they'd like to be, or they are in Baltimore, but they're trying to play by the rules, so they're in Baltimore in an apartment by themselves all the time. Right. Which is a different kind of isolation, right? And then, feeling guilty about getting a coffee with somebody outside, or, I hung out with them 3 weeks ago once, and we had breakfast together, and so now it just becomes, it's a different kind of stressor for them, because most 20-year-olds don't have spouses and families, right? So they in their own families. So they are, if they are back on campus or near campus, they're living by themselves or maybe with a roommate, right?
Right.
And so it's just a
Yeah,
different.
and what I'm hearing you say is that that peer interaction is such an important developmental part of young adulthood. And that's
Absolutely.
for months and months now. So it's unreasonable to expect those same people to come back to campus and continue like hold up in their dorms.
Yes. that is an unreasonable ask.
Yeah.
And that's why I think, if that is an unreasonable ask and we all agree that having parties of 100 people or more is not a good idea, then we as the adults who care about them need to help them figure out what are the things that are probably okay, where are the ways that we can mitigate our risk and be able to do stuff that feels a little bit normal, and how does that work, right? And I think on the institutional end of things, I think it's more work, but I think it'd be really worth it to have those conversations, because I do think getting the buy-in of the young people, the students, is going to be incredibly important. Because once 20-year-olds dismiss the older generation, forget it. And again, if we're being really honest with ourselves about thinking back to what we were doing when we were 19 and 20, once a grown-up kind of crossed that line and said something real stupid that you knew they were tone deaf on something and they just totally didn't understand, well, then we're not going to listen to them anymore. And that's part of the deal of being that age. And that doesn't make them bad people. It just makes them, regular and completely normal young adults.
Right. So let's just turn to my final question for you, which is what's getting you through right now?
It's a great question. Honestly, so what you and your colleagues are doing in Dear Pandemic is one of the things that makes me have hope in the world. I do think that there's a lot of good work to be done in this world, and you guys are doing it. So the young people that I work with through A Place to Talk are just incredible young people. And if we can help them cope and survive through this ridiculous chapter of world history, they're going to do amazing things, because they're just amazing young people with an enormous amount of motivation and compassion and brains to go with it. And so my heart really, really goes out to them, because they're struggling. Yeah. And then, right now I'm at the beach, and honestly, having the change of scenery of not being in the four walls that I'm used to being in at home, and being outside, knowing that in December that will not be nearly as fun of an option here in this area of the world, has been very, very nice to spend some time with immediate family and being outside in the sun.
Good. Well, we will let you get back to your vacation. Thanks so much for joining us from your beach house.
Thank you.
And for your thoughts on how we can help young adults return to college and do it safely.
Thank you.